Hi, everybody. Welcome. We'll get started in just a moment. I see folks joining right now from all around the world. Thank you. Welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Thank you for joining us for our event today, The People's Oceans, Building Sustainability Through Equity and Justice, with our guest, Anand Giridharadas. My name is Constance McBaron, and I lead communications efforts for both hosting organizations, EarthLab and the Nippon Foundation Ocean Nexus Center. And I want to thank my colleagues, Ali and Karen, for your work to make this event happen. Before I introduce you all to our event and our speakers, I would like to begin by acknowledging the land on which I live and work, where numerous tribal communities have lived since time immemorial. I acknowledge and honor the past, present, and future Coast Salish people of this land, the land which touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. From wherever you are joining us today, I encourage you to learn more about the land you are on. And if you are in North America, a good resource is to visit www.nativeland.ca. So we know land acknowledgements are important to say, but they must be followed up by meaningful action. That is why I'm so proud to join you today representing two organizations that are committed to centering equity and justice in our work. EarthLab is a visionary institute at the University of Washington that pushes boundaries to develop innovative, just, and equitable solutions to environmental challenges, with a focus on issues at the intersection of climate change and social justice. We do this by connecting across sectors and academic disciplines to inspire and incentivize new partnerships that bridge the UW and the wider community. The Nippon Foundation Ocean Nexus Center is a transdisciplinary international network of ocean researchers founded on developing a new way to operate ocean governance. So it includes the voices of ocean communities and prioritizes the diversity of current and future relationships that exist between people and the oceans. So EarthLab and Ocean Nexus Center are excited to co-host this event today, which will consist of a critical discussion between our speakers, followed by a Q&A. So please enter your questions into the Q&A box at any time, and you can also upvote on your favorite questions. So now to quickly introduce our speakers and get into it. First, I would like to introduce you to Yoshitaka Oja, the director of the Ocean Nexus Center and a professor of practice for the University of Washington's School of Marine and Environmental Affairs. Yoshi has a background in social anthropology at the University College London. He has conducted ethnographic research on various coastal communities, including Palau, the United Kingdom, Indonesia, and Japan. And his core research interest is to understand how to strengthen social equity in ocean governance while we face global environmental challenges. And last but not least, I'm very happy to introduce you to our guest, Anand Giridharadas. Anand is an editor-at-large for Time, an on-air political analyst for MSNBC, and a visiting scholar at the Arthur L. Carter Journalism Institute at New York University. He is joining us today as the author of his most recent book, Winners Take All, The Elite Charade of Changing the World, which is a New York Times best-selling, groundbreaking investigation of how the global elite's efforts to change the world actually preserve the status quo and obscure their role in causing problems they later seek to solve. So now, with what I'm sure is thunderous applause, I hand it off to Yoshi and Anand. Please take it away.
Thank you very much, Constance. And Anand, so nice to meet you. Thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate this. I got your book.
Such an honor for me, and very happy to be in conversation with you.
Excellent. So, let me just explain why we set it up. I mean, we're doing the oceans, and why it's. I mean, as much as your book is excellent, and I just want everybody to read it. I'm just going to explain why we just set up and are hosting this event. I mean, the recently, it's been about 5 years or even more, but 10 years, you just hear about the ocean is crisis everywhere. And it's crisis because of the climate change, because sort of a new phenomenon is happening, fish is depleting, the pollution is going up. And you just see these things in the media, Netflix and TED Talks and, all those things. And, there are lots of actors trying to solve it. And we as a Nexus, and then I myself personally as a social anthropologist, I work with the communities and the fishers and all this, and I kind of understand what they're thinking about it. They're not so evilly just getting all the fish and being greedy. You know, some people really wanting to pass it to next generations and really trying to make ends meet. But the other part of the world, or decision making, or governance, which is like government and more so of NGOs and philanthropists, you know, and including those who are actually donating money and coming with the money to save the ocean. I don't know, I have no idea what they are like. And so today I'm really like to be a student and kind of like, you know, use it as an informant to know about what they are like, you know, who are those winners and how do you argue they are taking all? Can you just sort of start expanding from that, please?
Yeah, that's well, first of all, it's an honor to be with you all. And I think I love that question because it actually gets at my motivation for writing Winners Take All. You captured it perfectly in what you said. So you are studying this issue of oceans and fisheries, and you're a social anthropologist, and you're studying these kinds of questions in the way that is normal for most people who study these things. Or you could talk about people who study inequality or people who study hunger or any issue. Is we generally study people kind of at the bottom of the power distribution. We study the people who are affected by the problems. And I have done a lot of that kind of journalism in my life. I've written about inequality in America. I've written about inequality in India. I've written about an age of these widening gaps. And what we always do is we go into a slum in Mumbai and write about the lives of the people living on the wrong end of power and poverty. We go into a neighborhood on the west side of Chicago and write about, as I did, a young man who can't go to school without fearing that he'll be shot every single day. And I think that kind of journalism is very important. That kind of storytelling and academic work is important. But I realized over the course of doing this work that writing about, trying to understand something like inequality or the way the world works on these questions, by writing about the people at the bottom on the wrong end of power is a little bit like studying architecture by walking into the Notre Dame and interviewing the first few tourists you find in the lobby. They happen to be the people standing in the structure. They didn't design that structure. They didn't make that structure. They didn't make the choices to have that structure be what it is. And so I began to wonder, what if you wrote about the era of inequality by actually talking to the people who designed it, by actually talking to the people who made the choices to have an age of inequality, by actually speaking to the architects, not the tourists in the lobby. People who happen to be poor in a given moment, happen to be struggling, happen to be on the wrong end of power, make no choices to have the world look like this. They're just dwellers in the reality that someone else concocted. So I spent a few years of my life going into this world of the very wealthy and powerful, interviewing them, hanging out with them, trying to genuinely understand, as you have with Fisher people, how to genuinely understand what they think, how they think, what's going on. And the thing I focused on was the way in which, in this era, they tend to have a self-image as do-gooders. They not only are aware that we live in an age of inequality, they deplore the inequality on the surface. They say they are against it, many of them. They advocate higher taxes in theory. And then when you get down to what they're doing about it, they're fighting for equality and justice in any way possible, except any of the ways that would actually threaten their wealth and power.
So my understanding is, you know, it's they have so much money, simply speaking. And I mean, I don't know how wealthy they want it to be, how skilled they like to be, how much, you know, they want to expand their security, but they have enough to secure their life. They don't really have to expand. What drives them to just really keep this structure? Because they probably know in the end, it's not just only affecting them, it's going to affect the generations, which their families and everything. As a social anthropologist, I have to talk about the love of the kings and everything, you know? Can you tell me, do they not to understand this? Or is there something else which just drive and push them more strongly than this comprehension of, normal knowledge under this climate change scenario.
Look, I think this group of plutocrats is, what I would call a diverse group of white men. And what I mean by that is they have a mix of motives, right? I think so you look at Mark Zuckerberg. I actually am not sure Mark Zuckerberg is particularly motivated by money. I think Mark Zuckerberg is motivated by a kind of messianic view of how the world should be reorganized according to his technologies. And in some ways, he's much more dangerous. I mean, we could just give him some giant investment fund and get him to go away if it was that simple. I actually don't think he would take that deal. I think he has a project of connecting people in the way that he thinks we should be connected that is profoundly dangerous and maybe his motivation. I think if you go to the financial industry, it's much more straightforward. Money is the scorecard and people want more of it. And then I think there's a lot of people in between. I think the more important motivator is often power, immunity. I think these people also understand that their ability to protect, to keep and hold that wealth and power depends not just on having that in their bank account, but on the society believing certain things. And if the society were to cease to believe those things, their wealth and power is actually quite precarious, right? We are not that, we are always potentially days away from a wealth tax. The only thing preventing a wealth tax is overwhelming public support for it that would just make that happen, right? And so part of what I found in my research is that they are very attentive to resentment. They're very attentive to what is being said out there about them. And they weaponize the idea of giving back to prevent the kinds of efforts that could threaten that wealth and power. So when you have a wealth tax coming in, suddenly they start talking about their philanthropy. When you have people having concerns about the financial industry after 2008 and the meltdown, you suddenly have the rise of social investing and social venture capital and impact investing. Every time there is a risk of being on the wrong side of history and being caught up in revolutionary sentiments, there is a counteraction of do-gooding that is meant to trick people into thinking that we should actually preserve the system as it is and let the winners throw scraps as the only kind of progress we can believe in. And I wrote the book to encourage people to see through those illusions.
Thank you. It's really, it's an illusion. And in your book, there's the moment I just start shouting, reading it, saying like yes and all that. And one of the part is when you actually start talking about like those illusions are in so-called win-win solutions. What did you actually see is really easy to just crack this win-win sort of like a BS to some extent.
I mean, it's so funny. I love that you pick up on that, because if I had to pick one idea that my book was trying to attack, it was this idea of the win-win. And I would bet most people listening to this, if you haven't thought a lot about this particular issue, my bet would be casually, you might think win-win sounds good. I mean, winning is good. And so 2 wins is better than 1. What's wrong with winning? And what win-winism, which is, it's really an ideology I describe in the book, has become a very dominant view in our time. And it basically says we can solve the biggest shared problems on Earth in ways that do not require the most powerful, the people with the most impunity, doesn't require anything to fundamentally change in their world, right? In other words, we can do justice. We can have racial justice without white people having to give up a thing. We can have economic justice without billionaires having to give up a thing. We can have better lives for workers without corporations having to give up a thing. In fact, all of those parties can benefit, right? And while money is not finite, power is. And in fact, if you think about a member of Congress who has to make decisions about who to listen to, who to meet with or not, half an hour meeting with you is half an hour they're not meeting with me. right? And whether they are voting with the thing you want them to do, or they're voting on the thing I want them to do,
Right.
they can't vote both yes and no. If you and I have different feelings about a bill, if labor and capital have different feelings about a bill, if men and women have different feelings about a bill. And so there has been this real effort in the neoliberal era to tell a win-win story, right? We can, and I'm sure this, I'm only vaguely aware of these things. You're the expert, but I feel like I hear a lot of these things with regard to the ocean, right?
Oh, yeah, Bob. Yes, yes.
Like drink this water bottle and save, and we'll donate something to the ocean to protect some of the fish that were suffocating or whatever, and what it's designed to do is to lull people into a feeling that we don't need shared solutions to these problems. We don't need public solutions. We can solve these things by donating $3 extra at Walgreens, by buying Tom's shoes, by having JP Morgan, fight to make our urban cores bring life to them, by having Goldman Sachs and Starbucks, as they recently did, teaming up to fight the racial wealth gap, even though Goldman Sachs wiped out so much Black wealth with the 2008 financial crisis, and Starbucks is busting a union right now, which is a known method of helping Black families and others achieve some level of stability and wealth. If we keep falling for the story that we can kind of Starbucks and Goldman Sachs and Gates Foundation our way to justice, at some point that becomes on us. At some point, we are ignoring the very real evidence that these very powerful forces and actors and people and institutions, their fundamental goal is to actually keep the world the same and use the rhetoric of changing it as an instrument toward that purpose.
And then, that makes me feel deeply in trouble sometimes, but at the same time, there's sort of like three things in my mind. It's one is it's kind of weapon. It's not just white male or people who's in that way. Your book kind of like shows some sort of like thought leaders. We're coming from very different backgrounds, and then they have this rebel sort of package, and and including myself, some of my students wanted to be a changer, but they brought into these areas, and then they're kind of like being tricked with these images and narratives and a win-win, and then they start like engaging with these conversations and solutions and foundations and companies and all this. What else can they do, really? Is there any chance they could do something different? Surely they could be a politician, but it's miles away. So
that's a great, look, I would say one of the tragedies of the neoliberal era, of this 40-year period we've been living through, is that a story was told about government being bad, right? Ronald Reagan, the era of big government is over. Margaret Thatcher, there's no such thing as society, only individual men and women.
Exactly.
Right? I think sometimes people confuse their own profound isolation and loneliness and lack of solidarity for others with a philosophy. But those are very influential people. And they were part of launching this neoliberal era that has told repeatedly the story that government is bad, government is a leech, government is slothful, government takes, government is for despised minorities that the majority doesn't like, et cetera, et cetera. And so I don't blame any young person today for having no story in their head besides that one about government, because that is literally the only culturally available story in our time. Even those of us who are progressive and this and that, it's rare to hear people making a muscular case for government, or to hear those people themselves wanting to go in and work in government. So what I would say is actually we need among many other things, a kind of revolutionary shift in the willingness of young people to go into public service. And it's not just running to be a politician. We have, I think the number is 90,000 distinct government entities in the United States, right? From the county level organizations to all the way up to the federal government, from foreign policy to, being a public school teacher is working for the government. I mean, working for the, Food and Drug Administration is working for the government, so on and so forth. And I think we need to call young people back in a wave into serving their society. And by the way, in an age where we've stolen so much wealth and opportunity and stability from young people, those are actually some of the most stable, reliable jobs around. So I think you could see a return of young people. I mean, which Gen Z person of conscience wants to go work for Facebook? I mean, what kind of person would you have to be willing to work at Facebook? I don't know that many Gen Z people who are such a morally aware generation. I don't meet a lot of Gen Z people who would work at Facebook. So where are they going to go? Where are they going to go? And maybe they will come back to the idea of various forms of public service as the place you go to make change. But also, and I say this towards the end of the book, talking to this philosopher, Chiara Cordelli, it's not just about rushing back into public service. It's about creating the conditions for public service to be able to solve our biggest shared problems, right? So you look at something like the oceans, it's not just saying, okay, government should solve the oceans, go. It's saying, what are the conditions it would take for the government to be able to solve those problems, so that, we're not relying on some like Evian initiative to save the oceans, or Matt Damon, or whatever it is. Like what does it look like to actually have the public capacity, the people, the resources, the mandate for our government entities to solve our biggest shared problems?
Thank you. I mean, properly decouple. I'm sorry, I just had to say that. But so there's three things comes up, okay, but we're just going to kind of lose the attraction, we always have this attraction, perhaps my age and somebody younger, is one is money. So it's not really just wanting to get the money, but kind of like a belief that we need the money to change it. Under the COP and the climate change, now people talking about like, how much government putting onto this net zero initiative, but it's all about the money. We got raised so much. So there's power of the money. And they said we need it for the transformation and transition. And that's a reality. That's one thing. There's another thing we have to approach sort of like a globally. Kind of global initiative is really important. And you actually devoted one of the chapters for that, for the Clinton Global Initiative. And I met a few people and they disappeared. I don't know what happened. But so that's another thing. So this is like money and this global scale and the impact it still attracts to us. Is there any, do you actually see that's a part of the narratives, and is there any truth in that whatsoever?
Well, I think what you're getting at is, this question of resources to solve some of these big problems is very difficult. I mean, I look at the recent piece that David Wallace Wells wrote in New York Magazine about climate justice and climate reparations. I mean, some of the calculations they're making is that, an appropriate degree of climate reparations for the developing countries from the rich countries would be equivalent to almost half the wealth that exists on Earth today, right? So we are talking about crazy amounts of resources that may be required to solve these big problems. And but it's not just that it's not just the scale of the problems that makes it, I think, that makes me believe in public solutions. It's also that when you have Bill Gates running around trying to create a new kind of energy grid, or Bill Gates running around trying to do vaccines, or Jeff Bezos trying to fix education, or go to space and reinvent space travel, it's fundamentally different. When our pursuit of the good, of the common good, of research, whatever, is guided by one man's midlife crisis versus the common good, the common interest, right? Like when Neil Armstrong went to the moon, it wasn't because Neil Armstrong had just gotten divorced and needed to like impress his new girlfriend. Like it was a public project of the United States, right? And it was funded that way. We funded that. We made an investment together in getting Neil Armstrong and his people to the moon. And and I don't think the exploration of space or the investigation of medicines should be driven by what a random rich person is feeling on any given day.
So if the random rich person will come in and just join us, I mean, I'm sure he will say, yes, you know, you all sounds correct and government will be great, but they're so inefficient. They're so slow, you know, under the climate change and everything else. We don't have much time. We just gotta be driven and we gotta do the things, you know.
Sorry, you cut either you cut out or I cut out for a second. But
Yeah,
I think I got the idea.
thank you.
I hear that one all the time, and it's a really important one that we have to deal with. You know, so what these rich people say is exactly as you said. Like, I totally agree with you in theory, but unfortunately, government is just not up to the task, so I have to do it. And there's two problems with this answer.
All right.
First of all, to the extent that it is true, I don't actually concede that it's true, but to the extent that it is true that government is less capable, it's less capable because they made it less capable. These are the guys fighting to defund the government, fighting to defang the government, fighting to defenestrate regulations, fighting to create a reality in which the government has the mandate to do less, could be, you know, has less resources to do things, is maligned so that it doesn't have the moral authority to do them. So first, you and your rich friends push for a world in which government can and does, can do less and is able to, you know, is not able to do as much as, let's say, a generation ago. And then you use the fruit of your ill-intended labor to justify the thesis that we shouldn't trust government with responsibility, right? I mean, it's like me stealing your jacket and then blaming you for being cold. You know, I'm the cause of the problem, masquerading as the solution. Second, I actually don't think the thesis is true. I do not think there is any evidence for the fact that these private sector people are more efficient than government. It is a simple category error we make, okay? And I'll explain why.
Please.
If you solve trivial problems faster than people solving very complicated problems, you are not more efficient than them. You're just solving more trivial problems, okay? It is, I know Amazon seems like a really big achievement, right? In a company like Amazon, there's one person who can make decisions. If there's a conflict, one can, you know, you don't have a lot of stakeholders you have to worry about, right? And we know from the way that company's run, they don't worry about various stakeholders. And it's quite easy. I'm not saying it's easy to be the most successful winner in that business versus others, but to run a business like that, where you basically are just optimizing for one thing, which is making money and increasing market share and more business. That is a trivial problem compared to the problem of how do we have 300 million people flourish? Or take a bite-sized problem for the government. What is our food safety situation for 350 million people? How do we make sure meat is safe? How do we make sure produce is safe? How do we make sure farm workers are safe, right? All these things the government does. Are you telling me that the government, state, local, federal government work to make sure that we in the United States eat safely? You're telling me that's less efficient than what Amazon does? Where's the evidence? Because I, like you, have been to a lot of countries in the world. There's a lot of countries, including the one my ancestors come from, India, where you get sick when you eat out, like every third time you eat out.
Okay.
That's how the world, that's how everywhere was until pretty recently in human history. Right? And a handful of countries thanks to the blessings of wealth and very effective government programs, have essentially eliminated foodborne illness from the experience of most people's lives, right? You go back to any of our ancestors' lives 100 years ago, right? And people are just getting all kinds of things all the time and dying of them sometimes, or getting sick all the time, and many parts of the world still. Well, we live in a country where we've eliminated that more or less, right? And there's a massive, I'm just picking one issue, there's a massive apparatus of government, state, local, federal, New York City restaurant inspectors, people at the USDA, people at the FDA, just all kinds of things you don't even think about. And they have made it so that 350 million people can get food at grocery stores and farmers markets and at restaurants and at cafes, and almost never get sick and die from that food. That's, I don't know, that's pretty efficient to me. I don't know what we spend on that, but I would love anybody in Silicon Valley to tell me how their return on investment is higher than whatever we spend on food safety, and the fact that we now live till, 90 instead of 35 because we're not dying of dysentery all the time, right? I'm just picking one little issue. You could look at the federal court system. The federal courts in America cost $8 billion a year. $8 billion. The full federal district courts, appellate courts, Supreme Court, the marshals, the whole thing, $8 billion. The whole federal, that whole system. Now think about that for a second. What do the US federal courts do? They do many things. They're the primary place that any corporation enforces its contracts, right? If you're a big company, your whole life is your contracts. If an employee is going to sue you, if another company is going to sue you for some deal going wrong, you're going to go to the federal courts, right? This is trillions of dollars of commerce per year that are protected in one of the most reliable court systems ever known to man. We may argue about what's happening with abortion or this and that. We forget 99% of cases are not these hot button issues. They're just regular, usually business, commercial stuff that just keep the society going. If you have an employment issue at your university or some, whatever. $8 billion, and you're protecting trillions of dollars of commerce, which any business person will tell you, without those courts, you try to start your business in Somalia. You try to start Goldman Sachs in Somalia, right? And a minister comes to you and says, I'd like 25% of this bank tomorrow. There's a reason that can't happen here. And that the reason it can't happen, among other things, is the courts. And so is that $8 billion that we spend on the courts that enables trillions of dollars of commerce around the world? Is that inefficient?
Okay. Anand, can I come back? So because we're working on ocean, a lot of issues what we're dealing with is very transboundary. 90% of what we eat in the seafood over here is coming from somewhere else. And we just share the border, which is not really, there's no line to it because it's in the water. And so this kind of like transboundary, global and connecting and all that sort of things. And because it's water and a fluid and all that, that kind of like makes the ocean conversation beyond the US. Now, the efficiency that you talk about is very much US model. And then sometimes, like you said, okay, you can't do it smartly, you can't do it any other places. So there's a tendency that why don't we take the US model to somewhere else? Why don't we take this US system, which is very efficient, really good, to Somalia? And we as a private person, we will help to do that. US will teach somewhere else outside of the world, and they'll do it much better. I fear the risk of it. That could be a part of the narrative, which is, something like a global initiative is pushing in a borderless and a global, those impact terms are kind of like telling us about it. Do you see that a little bit? I'm sorry, I'm just shifting the conversation from efficiency to this thing, but.
Well, I think part of that, and I write about this in my chapter that is about Bill Clinton and the evolution of Bill Clinton and this Clinton Global Initiative, which is very much this notion of problems now are different. Problems don't have passports, problems are transnational. Therefore, we need to have these kinds of global initiatives like the Clinton Global Initiative and Davos and the World Economic Forum and this and that, because problems don't respect national borders. So we need these kinds of solutions. The problem is, and I write about this quite a bit in that chapter, talking to Danny Roderick, the Harvard scholar, who's kind of the leading, I think, thinker on this question. The problem is we don't have democratic institutions really at the level of the world, right? We have the UN, but the UN is not quite a democratic institution. It brings together a lot of representatives from our democratic institutions, but I don't think a lot of people feel like it is an institution that they have any kind of leverage over the way you might feel you have some leverage over your member of Congress or legislator in a national legislature. And so when more and more problems are kind of pulled up into this global sphere to solve in these like global conferences and unelected bodies, while we may be addressing these problems, we are also moving in an anti-democratic way. And people, I think, really revolted against that. Part of the wave of anger over the last many years, both in the left and right, I think was part of a sense that basic decisions, democratic decisions, had been kind of pushed into this global sphere where unelected technocrats were making these decisions about trade and about the environment and this and that. And so it's complicated because we do have these problems that don't have passports, and we do need to solve something like the oceans. But I argue the first thing we need to do is have strong countries with strong governments that have the capacity to deliver locally, and escaping weak domestic politics to kind of solve something at the level of the world is kind of counterproductive. And Danny Roderick says it very well. He said the question we asked about globalization was, how can we do globalization and make sure our nation states, our democracies, go to work to make globalization possible? And he said the question we should have asked was, how can we make use of globalization to make our nation states more successful? Right? Globalization is not an end in itself. Solving problems at the world level is not an end in itself. At the end of the day, you need a healthy world that consists of healthy countries, healthy societies. And what we've seen is that when a country like America, particularly a country like America, is in bad health domestically, when its institutions are withering domestically, it gives the entire world a headache. And so I think it's great to be conscious and aware in the world, but like you look at climate change, right? I mean, it's not, I don't think, too simple to say climate change is one of the principal obstacles to climate change is like domestic issues in America. Like we are a woefully undereducated country. If you are an educated person in this country, your odds of believing that climate change is real go up quite a bit. Right? And those people who are against solving climate in America are stopping the whole world from solving it. Right? I think if we fix our education system, it would be a very good thing for climate. I think if you got money out of politics in America, that would move you further to doing things on climate for the whole world. So I think sometimes fixing the problems that our nation states bring to the global commons may actually do more for the global commons than showing up at these summits and trying to negotiate a deal. I think the best thing you can do at these summits is actually show up healthy as a democracy, not show up as a democracy that is kind of bleeding out on the street.
It's in some ways it's very interesting because at the beginning, you kind of like described this very heterogeneous, sort of like a power monger people, somebody who's really believe they're the one who's kind of like sort of designed the system which protects them from losing their wealth. And then they kind of like perpetuate doing so by bringing kind of like a new weapon, which sounds really good, win-win, thought leaders and, global initiatives and, all the things we're so intrigued upon. And, perhaps the problem is us. You didn't really talk in your book about so-called the usual people, but do you think it's a problem us sort of like believing and not educating, still having sort of like a messiah complex? Or, do they actually know, or are they so good at these people you actually studied, world winners? Are they so good at and so talented giving a story? Do you actually see any talent or, characteristics that they have that might be useful for the solution?
Well, I think the most important thing the winners of our age can do to help solve these problems is to get out of the way. They love to ask the question you just asked, which is, how can our talents be put to use? We're so smart. We've had so much success in these areas. Why can't we come into these areas? But before we invite them in to solve the problems they've just been helping to cause, I think it would be more useful to just get them to cease and desist from causing the problems, right? I don't need them to help me invent a new social contract. I just need them to stop avoiding taxes, right? I don't need them to help figure out, the future of gig work. I need them to stop obstructing unions. I don't need them to figure out, how to donate some proceeds from every water bottle to save the ocean that they're also polluting. I need them to just stop polluting the ocean. And so I think the most useful thing some of the winners of our age could do would be to stop using the money they make in business to purchase political power, which they then use to yank economic inequality even wider open. And I think that notion that they have often of, what can I do? What problem can I solve? What can I run? It's often a kind of Christopher Columbus instinct that motivates these people, right? They see everything as empty land that they can conquer. They don't notice to go to the point of that.
Yeah,
the
ocean. That's a good point.
They don't notice what's already there. And I think the more useful question for them to ask is not what can I do, what new thing can I start, is how have I been involved in these questions? In what ways am I already involved in these questions? And what can I stop doing? Not what can I start doing?
It's in some ways you kind of like a sort of like telling us that they really need identifying and recognizing more or less, something we usually tend to forget when we're looking for the solution, that it's studying history. Never do that, and then even in some ways, the environmental change narrative in a popular way kind of like start cutting off. I mean, things are very different in the future, so the history doesn't really work. But in some ways, this power struggle and the people who's got the power, who's seeking the power to just change the system and creating a systemic thing, that hasn't really been changed. So in some way that's really interesting. I mean, it's just telling me more about like we need to look at history now. They still want to make, well, now I'm coming back to like what's hot in the ocean, such as SDGs or, the global targets, and then they all wanted to make it. And then we kind of like tend to say, yeah, it's not perfect. Some are a bit not great, but at least those countries agreed upon it. So now they have to start making an effort. And, that's a good thing. So besides these people who's winners, do you actually think those global targets are still useful in your eyes? Or perhaps even that could potentially be more of the risk?
I love the SDGs because that to me is different. That is, as close as you get to some kind of democratic process at the world level. These governments really negotiated on behalf of their people and came up with this thing. And there was some effort, which the UN doesn't normally do, to actually make it a pop culture phenomenon, right? And with the pins and everything, and they tried to really,
Anand, you see those business people in the Davos, they're all wearing it, and then they
I don't take the business people seriously.
Yeah.
But I think the SDGs as negotiated and developed by governments,
Right.
were one of the more successful kind of public campaigns led by the UN to create kind of shared global goals. You know, I also think that these very powerful corporations are able to jump in and turn those things against the idea of real change, and to kind of create fake change that has the illusion of real change. So that becomes problematic. But I actually think we need things like the SDGs to really go even deeper down into our society, so that very regular people in all walks of life across the world are motivated by these goals, and maybe like turning it into games and having places compete with each other, and having provinces and states around the world compete with each other for, you know, who can decarbonize fastest, and actually involve people in an exciting process of governing themselves better.
Thank you. That's a yeah, interesting comment. I'm still like half about the SDG, to be honest, but because a lot of SDGs, particularly in the ocean, is a lot about environment, and not really so much about the society, to be honest. And you know, that divide between ocean and society, and nature and society, is very prevalent here. And but yet, if you walk into, you know, places like where your ancestor comes from, those boundaries between nature and society is not always there. And perhaps that's kind of like a worldview. We need to challenge it. But I shouldn't really speak too much. I mean, it's you know, Anand, it's a really great. And you know, I just wanted to grab this opportunity to ask you to help me to a little bit share the leadership that I have. It's a tiny project, but sometimes it's nice to ask, you know, somebody like you. So I was with a friend, and you know, asked him. And he knows like a corporate and a big people. And, you know, being London educated in the 90s actually doesn't really make me much of a neoliberal. It was kind of like opposite at that time. And then so I just asked him, like, look, you know, my background really doesn't make me feel like shaking hands with these people, you know, being nice to those people. I just wanted to say, like, get off, you know, I'm just going to go my own, and then not uncompromising and all that. And this friend of mine said to me, Yosh, don't let your ego to stop making, you know, doing this wonderful things that you do on the ocean research, to be more, you know, approachable and, you know, and supported by those people who actually got the power and the money. Anand, what should I do?
I mean, that's often a very difficult one, right?
Right.
I mean, I think the problem is we all live in the world that we live in right now. And a lot of us also want to see it changed. And I think what you have to figure out is, how do you live within this world and survive within this world, and make use of the realities of this world to actually try to get to a differently ordered world. You know, and look, I mean, the Bernie Sanders' campaign ordered things from Amazon, I'm sure, you know, and used private planes, and you know, AOC uses an iPhone, even though she thinks Apple should probably be broken up, so on and so forth. Like these kind of critiques never hold much water for me. People have to live in the world that they live in and use the tools of their time. And I think the more interesting question is, how do you use that kind of platform and power you have to feel comfortable yourself that you are pushing in a direction where those things could change. You're using those things against themselves. You know, I have a lot of strong feelings about the media and the way in which, you know, corporate media silences certain voices. But there's some people who kind of agree with me, who therefore would never ever engage in the corporate media. And I think the opposite. I think it's important for me to engage there as often as I can, because I want to change what's happening in those spaces. I want things to be said that maybe someone else is not going to say. And so I think you have to kind of hold your own principles strongly, and then engage with the world as it is to try to get it to be something else.
Thank you, Anand. In some ways, that underneath of this, the power and then attraction and the money and fake and then all that things which are very popular in those winners' world, I'm sure there's human in there, and I don't know to what extent it actually drives them into some other characters, but hopefully that work like yours and kind of like a reveal how we could potentially, I wouldn't say work with them, but really to just tell them or teach them they shouldn't really come into the place where with their own interest, but really to have a public interest, I believe. Okay, so Anand, do you have any question in the ocean?
So many.
All right, okay. Thank you. You should. I'm gonna pass my mic to my colleague, and Constance, and but I just have to say thank you so much. You revealed so many questions that I had, and thanks a lot for exciting conversation. Much appreciated.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the questions, and I hope this is. I know you all will find. I hope the relevance to the particular work that you all do.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much, both of you. I could listen to this all day, but we do have some questions coming in our Q&A, and we thought it'd be a nice way to transition to the Q&A by inviting one of Ocean Nexus's research scholars. I'll do just a brief intro. So Marlene Shooter is a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Washington and at World Fish. And her work focuses on the relationships between people and the sea with an explicit aim to address equity and justice issues in the blue economy. So we thought she'd have a great question to start us out with and transition to the Q&A. So Marlene, please ask your question. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Constance, and thank you very much for that great conversation and for the book. I really love the book. I have it here. I really enjoyed reading it. I have quite a few questions, but I'll just ask one and leave some space for others as well. So as you know, we at Ocean Nexus, we are particularly interested in justice and equity issues around ocean spaces. And some of us are working on this emerging concept that's named the blue economy. Well, if you talked about win-win situations, and the blue economy sometimes even tends to take it even further and talks about triple wins. So win-win-win situations, very much tied to the idea of sustainable development. So it has this aim of sort of tapping this economic potential of oceans, but at the same time also wants to improve social equity and environmental sustainability. And so when I was reading your book, I noticed some overlap between what some of us have identified in blue economy and your diagnosis on maintaining this status quo. I think your book can also very much be read in terms of hegemony and challenges to hegemony and how those are neutralized. So that's where I saw this connection with the blue economy, which is also a lot around discourse that's sort of neutralizing these challenges to current systems of production and consumption. For example, greening the production and things like that. So it seems to be quite similar to sort of the discourse around philanthropy and sort of these win-win situations. And so the question that came to my mind is, how can we as researchers support or sort of make visible, much more visible, sort of this counter hegemony that's arising. So that there are people who are raising these challenges to these current models, but how they're up against these powerful vested interests, and sometimes that counter hegemony doesn't really come across. So I think it's really important to support this sort of counter power and counter hegemony as effectively as possible. And I was just wondering if you could reflect on that. What can we as researchers do to sort of keep these challenges in view, basically? Yeah.
Well, thank you for that, Marlene. I would say it obviously depends what kind of research you do and what your tools are and what your skills are. But I think I will say as a general comment, one thing I observe and have talked to a lot of people who work in various phases of the environmental movement, defined broadly, whether it's oceans or, agriculture or climate or whatever, is that partly because of funding structures, partly just because of a kind of ethic of politeness in these fields, there has often been a little bit of an avoidance of talking about the truly bad actors, and an effort to focus on solutions or what can be done, or, on the answers. But you literally have people like right over there causing the problem right now. And a lot of people don't say anything, I think part of why Sunrise as an environmental group was so powerful in the last few years is because it was really, really different from kind of the older line Nature Conservancy and all these groups. Like Sunrise understood that there are villains in the story, right? And Sunrise didn't take money from those villains to kind of mitigate reputation. So I think there's a lot of research to be done on how these systems work. Who is polluting the oceans? How are they doing it? What political connections are they buying? What is their tax situation? Like, how do they use philanthropy? Like, that's what I would want to read, right? And that stuff really radicalizes the public too. And I think instead you have this kind of often like airy thing about we could do this, or we could solve this, or we could that. Like, people actually think about any movie you've seen. Like, people need to know who did what to whom, and then what do we need to do? It's like, and these things are crimes we're talking about. What's happening to the environment, what's happening to the oceans, these are not tragedies, they're crimes, and yet the way we often talk about them is as tragedies, is as these kind of like systemic, just like sort of like complex weather systems of sadness. No, like, there are some people in a room somewhere making plans to do crimes to the water and to the land and to the air and to everything else. And I think there's just like a need for a lot more research on that. I would love to have a lot more research on, who's doing the overfishing and what the motives are and how they buy off legislators. I would love to read more on how ExxonMobil conquers governments and, alters the discourse. I think there's just so much research to do on how the system works and makes solutions so elusive.
Yeah, great. Thanks very much. Yeah, so we are contributing by sort of unveiling these power structures and sort of putting it out there and sort of saying it as it is. And I think one thing that you said on sort of the politeness of not really wanting to highlight those, I think that's maybe even made worse by some of the pragmatism that some other people also exhibit, because they say, well, this is how it is, and we just need, like, money talks, so we just need to phrase our issues into that market world lingo that you also write about. So
completely,
yeah, inspiring. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marlene. So we do have quite a few questions in the Q&A, and I see some emerging things coming through, so I might combine a couple of them. And I think one question that is a nice segue from what Marlene just asked about what can researchers really do is a question from Andres is, thanks for a great book in chat. This focus is obviously on very privileged, very wealthy people, but what about others? And two also asks, like, what about young professionals? So what are other ways to combat this? Others who may be privileged in some ways, but not certainly wealthy or powerful, is there still a role for individual actions by non-oligarchs, collective action, unionization, etc.?
Absolutely. I mean, and to be clear, I actually do not think the oligarchs are the solution to these problems. I'm not asking the oligarchs to do anything. I'm actually asking the oligarchs to remove themselves from the solution to these problems, because I think they make them worse. And the things that I argue in the book are the solution are bottom up, our unionization, our small d democracy, our organizing, our efforts to persuade our own fellow citizens about things where there's not enough public support as yet. whether it's on universal health care or a wealth tax or whatever else. I believe democracy is the answer, and more of it is the answer. And what we have been lulled into is this story that the world is saved from above. And I think what history has shown is that we actually save ourselves from below. We make choices. That's what democracies do. We make choices to expand who is included, who has dignity, who has the ability to live a decent life and pass on a decent life to their children. Those shifts in history have never been because the rich and powerful were feeling kind one morning. Real change involves the loss of power.
I agree. Well said. Let's shift to NGOs. I think there are a couple questions about that. We have Sarah asking, what is your view of the role of large NGOs in the work of shifting the dynamics around some of these issues? And then Megan asked about the people working for NGOs. She said, you talked about young people returning to public service. We're also interested in working for NGOs addressing oceans and other issues. So what should be the responsibilities of young people working for NGOs to ensure the independence and efficiency of these institutions and preventing them from using that as a lever for the wealthy?
Yeah, I mean, this is a very, I get so many people reach out to me who are in exactly that situation every week. And I would summarize the dilemma as, there are these problems where the only place people feel like they could work on them would be in a nonprofit space, but the nonprofit space has this very compromised relationship to oligarchs, and in many cases has a complicated relationship to the specific oligarchs who are doing bad things over here while funding micro solutions to them over there, right? So you might be, getting indirectly or directly some Exxon money for some climate project. Do you take it? Do you not? Do you stay? Do you go? All of that. It's very hard. What I would say is you have to, I don't think there's a blanket answer. I think you have to ask yourself, is your nonprofit, is the way your nonprofit operates, is it actually taking on the power structure and pushing it to change? Or is it selling big corporations and wealthy people drive-through reputational laundromat services? And it's important to answer that for yourself. A lot of this kind of money that nonprofits take, nonprofits are, if they're being honest with themselves, they're really selling a service to these rich people. They're selling them stink removal services. And what that really is doing is enabling them to keep doing the stuff that gives them the stink, right? These companies don't just have a stink from a one-time activity that they need the stink washed off. Their business model makes them stink. Mm-hmm. And that's why they're in constant need of reputational laundering. And nonprofits, universities, arts institutions are often in this position where deep down they know that the reason they're getting that $1 million a year from that organization is because that organization has a huge reputation problem. And so then it becomes very complicated. It says in nonprofit, what is your fundamental role here? Are you fundamentally working to solve the issue that you work on? Or is your real effect on the world to make it slightly easier for these bad actors to be bad?
Yeah, those are conversations we've been having a lot here too, just, at the university level as well. Where does our funding come from? And it's a lot of hard questions and a lot of hard answers there.
And I think just to say one more word on that, I think the Jeffrey Epstein situation should have been a wake-up call for American universities. These were not podunk little universities. These were Harvard and MIT. A, they don't need any extra money. B, they have so much on the line reputationally. And when Jeffrey Epstein had his first criminal cases in Florida, which he managed to deal with and minimize. He moved to New York, and there was this great article in the New York Times about actually how isolated he was in New York. He was like this predator with a townhouse, and he was isolated. He was not like the talk of the town. People were concerned about being associated with him. Then what did he do? He starts donating to Harvard and MIT. He starts hanging out, with Larry Summers and Steven Pinker and all these people, MIT Media Lab, this and that. He starts becoming like a man who's hanging around with these prestigious scientists and scholars. He's in all these Harvard things. They literally name I think a center for him. The PED Center at Harvard is actually called the PED Center. Talk about just like leaving clues for people and they still can't pick them up. And he slowly changes his reputation. And suddenly back in New York, he's now a hot item. And Bill Gates is hanging out with him and this and that. So now pause the story and analyze the story. And now we know that after that happened, and he was back in good graces and able to be at parties and have people we knew that he raped more girls after that, after his, atonement tour. So now think about what were those contributions that he made to Harvard and MIT? You still want to call those academic donations? You still want to call Harvard and MIT nonprofits in this situation? Harvard and MIT were a business selling him a product. The product was reputational Febreze. It was a specific product to make a socially unpalatable person palatable. It costs X. You give us the money. You let you be photographed for these professors. We understand it's shady, but we are Harvard. We're so prestigious that we can afford to bleed a little prestige and take a few hits in the media because you're giving us this much money to do whatever, right? But then think about Harvard has reason to know what Jeffrey Epstein is going to use the product they have sold him for. Harvard has reason to know that he's going to use that reputational Febreze to spray himself clean in the public square. And they have reason to know he's going to use the new cleanliness to rape girls. You would have to be quite idiotic to not understand that that was the transaction.
Right.
And so what is the position of the nonprofit, the arts institution, the university that is selling reputational Febreze to these people? Do you understand that what you're doing is not only cleaning them up, you are selling them a moral license to go do a bad thing tomorrow. And I think we need a real reckoning at universities and nonprofits in general about the complicity in taking money from people who they have reason to know are going to use the reputational shine to go hurt people tomorrow.
Yeah, and that's, I'm sure, just one really, one salacious example, but just one example of that happening over and over again. You did mention that this is a business model that the universities are deploying, and we do have a question about business. And we know that it will take everybody, from all sectors to solve a problem like climate change. And that's something that we're looking towards is, corporations and businesses. And so Elna has a question. The crisis the world is facing are problems that cross judicial boundaries, such as climate change. Do transnational corporations have a better chance to make a difference globally compared to countries? So she said, take the case of Australia's lack of commitment to reducing emission at COP26, for example. Would companies like Adani and Santos that operate in many countries, are they in better position and capable to make a more effective change if they choose?
I understand where that logic comes from. Like, it is true that companies operate everywhere and countries are often, by definition, provincial. I mean, I literally have this chapter about the Clinton Global Initiative, which is really about this question. But I actually don't think that companies are the answer to these problems. And I'll tell you why, which is corporate virtue on any of these questions is always voluntary. right? It's always voluntary. And it's sort of like, it's sort of like, Constance, if someone who works for you at the university, let's say, you were to try to convince them, don't worry about this employment contract. Don't worry about filling out the employment contract. Don't worry about labor. Let's just do this on the side. You just come in and let's not sign all that formal paperwork. I will take care of you. Right? Maybe it's someone you know. Maybe it's someone you grew up with who has reason to trust you, right? But no one's going to take that job because there's a reason we have an employee. Who knows how you're going to feel next week? Who knows whether you get replaced and they got a new boss suddenly? Who knows whether, like, when you ask corporations to help us solve climate, they're going to change their mind. They're going to have new investors. They're going to, it gets a little expensive for them. They're going to pull back. It is no kind of foundation to rest the solution of our biggest shared problems on the voluntary virtue of companies that may change their mind every 5 minutes. There's also no evidence that companies have been able to move the needle on these things. It's hard to think about any kind of corporate action that would have the effect that a carbon tax would have, right? It's just very, very difficult. And by the same token, there's a reason that governments are very bad at making pens and small individual companies are very good at things like that. Or the governments are very bad at making, beverages, and that I am only talking about our biggest shared problems. All other things are pretty well supplied by the market. Right? I don't need my government to publish books. I don't need my government to organize air travel. I need to regulate air travel. I needed to regulate monopolies of publishing companies. I needed to, make sure the rules are fair for people. But when you talk about climate, when you talk about how do you empower women to play all the roles they can and want to play, when you talk about how do you solve 400 years of racial plunder of Black people in this country, when you talk about the oceans, when you talk about rising economic inequality, these are the kinds of problems for which I actually don't believe there are private solutions. I don't believe there are small solutions. I don't think you can scale up little private initiatives that are kind of cute little efforts by some bank or something and rise them up to the level of humanity. We have never solved our biggest shared problems through bottom-up private whim. And I don't think we're going to start now.
Yeah, that's a really good segue into this question a couple of people voted on about what policies should governments be pursuing. If we're going to be solving our biggest shared problems at the government level, they write that plutocrats have found their ways inside and outside of governments to change laws, and the neoliberal agenda was in self acted by governments. So we need more precise and particular story about what muscular governments should be doing with their executive and legislative powers. Do you have any ideas?
Well, there's sort of like what policy should they be doing, and then how can you, to the questioner's point, how can you also create the conditions where they're more likely to be making good policy? So on the kind of second thing, on the meta stuff, like getting money out of politics, having, cracking down on lobbying, those types of things, so that the public policy would be able to better reflect the public will. But look, there's a whole bunch of different things. I mean, here in the United States, we are talking about a bunch of them right now. I mean, Joe Biden, quite to my surprise, I was not a big Joe Biden fan, has proposed, at least in the original version of some of his agenda, quite a few things that would, they're not my dream version of the scenario, but would make a difference. I mean, I have 2 children, like having universal pre-K versus not is a very different America. Having community college be free or not, again, these, that has completely fallen out of the bill, sadly. Having old people have to pay for dental, vision, and hearing out of pocket versus not, these are very different societies that you get when you add all these things up. What is life like from birth to death? How difficult is it at each turn? How much is there a kind of common investment at each turn versus you being left to yourselves? These are not mysteries. These are proposals that are up for grabs every day. And first of all, there's very powerful actors who stand in the way of them, as we've seen. But actually, I don't think that's the only story. certainly in America, we haven't really won the argument with our own people on a lot of this stuff yet. I would love Medicare for all. I mean, I'm on Obamacare and it's a total disaster. I mean, I basically like avoid the doctor when I'm sick. I really wait till I'm in bad situations. And like, I'm a very lucky, privileged person, but even I like essentially just try to avoid going to the doctor, because even though I technically have insurance, it's the kind of insurance where for some weird reason or another, you just might get like a huge bill because I don't know, you called the doctor on the wrong extension or something. And yet I don't think that we've won the universal health care single payer argument among our own people. Like I just don't think we've won it. I think given the powers that be in this country, I think that would need to be like an 80% overwhelming support to have a critical mass to get that done. I don't think we're there. I think a lot of people like, clinging to their employer-based insurance. We haven't made a sufficient case, I think, for why this is not just, as Bernie Sanders called it, a human rights issue, though it is. It's also a freedom issue. You're not free if you can't quit your job because you depend on it for the health insurance. You're not free if your children require you to, your children's health and well-being require you to, do work that you don't love and don't believe in and that drains your soul. So, some of these things there is the work of going inside and doing policy, but there's also the work of organizing and activating public awareness and public consciousness so that there is enough demand to do these kinds of policies on the things that I advocate, which is whether it's a wealth tax or universal health care or getting money out of politics or clamping down on lobbying or having, a range of economic policies that are oriented toward cradle to grave dignity for every citizen.
And education, like you mentioned before as well, really important. So we just have a few minutes left, and there's a question here. So you've been talking about this winners take all in lots of different interviews and venues, and you've met a lot of folks. Have any winners you've encountered actually responded positively to your message? Do you try to reason with them or focus your efforts on collective action? How is that conversation going?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, first of all, my focus has never been that, in the sense that I don't think that's what's going to change it. I write the book very clearly. I say in the book very clearly, like, I think the solution to our biggest shared problems is actually getting them out of the way and working around them and solving problems democratically, kind of over their objections. I think the notion of needing permission slips from the plutocrats to decide which policies we can do, which types of fixes would be okay for them, is the problem. And so I'm very much dedicated to championing the kind of solutions that don't ask them what they think. That said, I'm a persuader by nature. I mean, I think that's what writing is. And I want all kinds of people to read this book. And I hope, if I'm right, it'll be true when plutocrats read it as well. They may not like it, but if it's true, it's true. And so I have had, I mean, look, there's a lot of people in that world who have, maligned me and said that I'm just jealous that I'm not a billionaire myself, or that I'm, I will, I mean, one guy said to me, I will understand when I'm older and actually finally have resources to conserve. I'll understand why some people are conservative. But a surprising number of people in those spaces, I find, some people I've met and some I've seen things they say online, and some it's not in my book, it's just other things I've seen them say. I think there is some amount of people in that world who are starting to change their awareness. You've had Eli Broad and some others write public letters advocating for greater taxes on their wealth. You've had people like Abigail Disney and Nick Hanauer. They're vocal minorities, but making a case for taxing rich people more. I think what I found in the book, and I had a lot of private conversations with some of these people who read it and felt kind of both attacked and maybe called in to some kind of solution, I think a lot of them understand that they are standing on a mountain that is morally indefensible, and they don't know how to get down. And, you know, at one level, you can kind of laugh at that, but I think we have to figure out how to, not with their permission, but how to actually make use of whatever that small group of opposition is. Because the power of those people is just morally, rhetorically, they kind of render the pretenses of their class to be kind of a joke. You know, they reveal the stupidity of notions like, if you don't incentivize rich people to keep as much as they can, you'll have no innovation. And these people who are inside that system will tell you, like, not true. Not true. It's not how it works, right? Or they will tell you. I mean, I had people tell me how a lot of these billionaires borrow against their equity and never have to ever sell stock, and therefore never ever have to pay capital gains tax, and just live off this constant stream of loans. Like, one very rich person explained that to me about other rich friends of his he knew, and that helped me, you know, understand one little aspect of their world. So I think we got to kind of make use of the allies, but not be lulled into thinking that they should have a veto over what kinds of policy courses we want to navigate.
Fascinating. Yeah, I think we have time for just one more question. It looks like a last minute question got upvoted to the top from Gerald, who is in our program office at Ocean Nexus. And I think it's, you know, about building that mountain that you were talking about in our role as workers in building that mountain. So David Gruber's ideas on bullshit jobs, professions that engender feelings of meaninglessness, argues that the most prestigious and high income jobs are built to support those at the top. Do you think that just doing our jobs needs to be challenged so that we don't prop up the powerful just to pay the bills? Is there a way to be neutral?
I mean, it's a great question. I think it depends on who you are, where you are, what we're talking about. But look, I do think, and part of what I was writing for with Winners Take All was that I had this feeling that there was something of an internal schism in a lot of these worlds, at universities, at nonprofits, at foundations, where there was often an older, encrusted leadership that was deeply steeped in the neoliberal order, that was often overwhelmingly white and male, that believed in the power structure, that in a way would defend a kind of unjust social order by saying, at least these people give back and we're going to take care of others. And often there were a lot of younger people and a lot of women, a lot of people of color in the ranks of these nonprofits or universities or foundations who kind of felt the opposite. And what they had that their bosses didn't have was a kind of lens of power, which is what a lot of young people today have. I mean, you can talk about wokeness all you want. I mean, wokeness actually just means a lot of young people coming up today have an awareness of power equations, and they know history, unlike people older than them. And, you know, they know a truth about who we've been and what it's like to be different types of people, including people who are not them, but they were able to kind of make those empathic leaps. So if that's wokeness, first of all, you know, I hope we have way more of it. And a lot of that group of people, I think my book said a lot of the things that those people thought and felt and experienced at work, but couldn't say. And that's what writers do. Writers are, you know, Tom Wolfe said, we're like the village gossips who can pick up, who can say those things that people can't necessarily say themselves because they get in trouble, they have to pay the bills. And so what I tried to do in Winners was not just, you know, say what I thought, but to kind of intervene in a low grade civil war that is within a lot of these spaces in the power structure, where a new generation and younger people and people who just think differently, regardless of age, are calling into question some of the basic tenets of how power works in America. And I'm very grateful that so many of them, you know, shared their stories with me for the book and helped me understand that world. And I, you know, hope I did them some justice.
Thank you so much, Anand. And I think that is all we have time for. Yoshi, great. I was going to ask you to turn your video back on behalf of EarthLab and Ocean Nexus Center. Thank you so much for joining us today. Yoshi?
Thank you very much, Anand. Yeah, great conversation. We learned a lot, and thanks for the strong words.
Thank you all so much. I really enjoyed the conversation.
So much. Have a great evening. Thank you everyone for joining us today.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks.